He wants him to what? To report which of his commanders he's had shot or is about to have shot. Okay, shot for what? For cowardice? Have they shot any? No. Wait, are any accused of being cowards? No. So who are they gonna shoot? You don't know. Huh? He's just showing them how tough he is, you guess. Okay, yeah. August 12th, 1944. 2 months ago, the Allies invaded France at the beaches of Normandy. They fought hard since then, and near the coast have finally achieved a breakout. But this week, something unexpected happens. This week, the Germans counterattack. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the American attacks in the west of Normandy began really breaking out, and they overran parts of Brittany. The British Operation Bluecoat ground out territory, but did not reach Montpasson. In Italy, the southern half of Florence fell to the Allies. In Burma, Myitkyina finally fell to them after the weeks of siege. The Soviets continued taking territory on the Eastern Front, but in Warsaw, the Poles began an uprising to liberate their capital ahead of the advancing Red Army. The brutality of the Germans against the Poles in Warsaw has grown exponentially by now, aimed at stamping out all resistance. Once an area was cleared, all Polish men were taken out and shot. Civilians were pressed ahead of tanks to form a living screen for German attacks. Prisoners were shot out of hand, and the wounded lying in the hospital were also summarily shot. All this week in Warsaw, the Volva massacre is in progress as well. Please watch our War Against Humanity series for an in-depth coverage of the uprising and the massacre and the whole of Operation Tempest. That is far more detailed than I could give you here. Followers of that series might remember the names Bach-Zalewski, Dirlewanger, and Kaminsky. The licensed killers, the penal brigade, and the ultra-violent SS brigade. Heinrich Himmler has set them loose in Warsaw to crush the uprising. As for the talks in Moscow between Polish Prime Minister in exile Stanisław Mikołajczyk and Joseph Stalin, Mikołajczyk has done as Stalin suggested and meets with the Lublin Committee the 6th. When he asks them for help in Warsaw, the committee tells him that Boleslav Bielrut, the committee chairman, left Warsaw the 4th. And it was quiet until then in the city, and London is misleading you about this uprising. They insist that the Polish Home Army be disbanded, which would, if done, mean the dissolution of the London government. They meet again the 7th, and Bielrut is there in person this time. Michał Rola-Zimirski, commander of the Soviet-raised Polish army, denounces how cavalierly the Home Army began the uprising, but says he has asked Stalin for supplies for the insurgents. When Mikołajczyk says he's talked to the Western Allies about airlifts, the response is, an agreement with the Western Allies does not suffice. It is an agreement with the Soviet Front Command that matters. They do start to discuss a possible government, but Mikołajczyk realizes that out of 18 posts, the committee will only assign 4 to the London Polish government in exile. There are more talks over the next few days, discussions over the 1935 Constitution as opposed to the 1921 Constitution. On the 9th comes a final meeting between Stalin and Mikołajczyk. Mikołajczyk asks for arms, and Stalin says that the whole Warsaw thing to him seems unreal since they haven't taken the city, which he thought they'd take by the 6th. And the Germans have 5 armored divisions blocking the way to the city. They talk about making an airdrop, and Stalin's agreement to this seems solid enough that on the 10th he gets a message of thanks from Winston Churchill. Those are basically the last friendly words any side has to say to any other about the Warsaw Uprising. And today on the 12th, Soviet news agency TASS issues a report that any statements that those rising up in Warsaw have been in touch with Soviet command and Soviet command has not given them the assistance required are either misunderstandings or outright slander. The secret tug of war had now become a public brawl, made the more ugly by the sickening background of destruction and killing in Warsaw itself. The Polish insurgents, surrounded now and bereft of all outside aid, save for the arms dropped sporadically by RAF planes, manned by British, Dominion, and Polish aircrew, making the long and hazardous flight from Brindisi, maintained contact between their three sectors by using the sewers as communications passages. Above ground, German assault squads and tanks fought to reduce the formidable Polish barricades one by one. German tank gunners, who could not subdue the living, took their revenge on the dead by firing incendiary rounds into the corpses strewn about the streets, or attempted to burn the populace alive by setting house after house alight. But let's go back to Stalin thinking his army would take the city by the 6th. This appears to have been supposed to be accomplished by a coup de main, a sudden surprise attack. John Erickson at least says it makes sense in light of what happens before. Konstantin Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front gets orders that after taking both Brest and Siedlce, his right flank armies are to move on to Warsaw and take it no later than the 8th. But his right flank has been slowed down and isn't anywhere near Warsaw. Vasily Chuikov's 8th Guards Army has been trying to expand its Magnusev bridgehead all of August so far, and that's not far south of Warsaw. But that has not gone so well and still isn't even really stable. So the chance to quickly take Warsaw is long gone if there ever was one, which I don't think there was. So Stalin isn't exactly exaggerating when he tells Mikołajczyk it will take some time to organize an operation against the city. As for the TASS report today, it is possible that he thought the rising in Warsaw would be quickly liquidated or else would peter out. His minimizing of the rising seems to suggest this. What is clear is that the very fact of a large-scale rising in Warsaw came as a surprise to the Soviet command. When the insurgents continued to fight against all odds, it became necessary to insulate Soviet policy and action, which explains the marked shift in attitude. The TASS communiqué of the 12th of August was a straw in the wind, placing the responsibility for all that is taking place in Warsaw exclusively on the Polish émigré circles in London. Stalin's forces are getting bogged down elsewhere this week too. By the 8th, Andrei Yeremenko's 2nd Baltic Front has cleared Krustpils of the enemy, but while this rail and road junction is an important capture, his forces elsewhere are getting really stuck. They do force the Ivikste River along its length, but the swamps and forces beyond heavily favor the defender. German Army Group North has been cut off from the main German army, but its commander Ferdinand Schöner tells Adolf Hitler the 6th that they can hold on until Army Group Center restores contact. Having no reserves worth mentioning, Schöner applied his talent for wringing the last drop of effort out of his troops. To one of the division commanders, he sent the message, Generalleutnant Charles de Beaulieu is to be told that he is to restore his own and his division's honor by a courageous deed, or I will chase him out in disgrace. Furthermore, he is to report by 9 p.m. which commanders he has had shot or is having shot for cowardice. One Baltic front over, Ivan Bagramian's First Baltic, the Soviet advance on Riga grinds to a halt. Well, he now has 3 times the front lines to control than he had a month ago, though now he has 4 armies instead of 3. He wants to concentrate his force, though, because the Germans are preparing a counteroffensive towards Šiauliai. The Soviets are preparing more than that, however. They continue with plans for their upcoming offensive against Romania. The significance of the move lay as much with the timing as with the forces committed. The new Soviet offensive must be closely coordinated with the massive operations proceeding at the center and in the northern theater. Already the 5 fronts sent rolling forward in June and July in Belorussia and the western Ukraine were at the beginning of August on the Vistula and closing in on the East Prussian frontier. But now, Stavka realized that an operational pause was inevitable in order to prepare for a massive push along the Warsaw-Berlin axis. In light of previous experience, such pauses involving the movement of strategic reserves and the provisioning for a new offensive lasted not less than 3 months. In order to make such a Warsaw-Berlin thrust, they'd first have to destroy a lot of Axis force in both the north and south, which they've been doing by throwing the Baltic fronts into action just after the Belarusian and Ukrainian ones made their offensives. But soon, they have to drop the hammer on Army Group South Ukraine to make all of this work. That army group, for all of its strength on paper, is not in a good position. Poised between the Red Army on one side and the Romanians, who are largely quite happy to leave the war and leave them to fight alone, on the other. Army Group South Ukraine Commander Johannes Friesner has Group Wöhler with 14 Romanian and 7 German divisions, and Group Dumitrescu with 7 Romanian and 17 Germans. This is like 600,000 men, 400 tanks, and 800 planes. But a looming big problem is that the German divisions are sort of connected by Romanian ones, like the Germans used to do in Africa with Italian infantry divisions, right? Stavka's directive to 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts last week for the Yassy-Kishinev operation says to destroy the enemy along the Yassy-Kishinev-Bender line, then advance to the Bashau-Tarutino line and set their sights on Fokshani, Galachai, and Ismail. The actual operational plans made by front commanders Rodion Malinovsky and Fyodor Tolbukhin are fairly intricate and very much involve encirclements and, of course, linking the fronts. One tricky place to fight is the Dniester estuary, which will need coordination with Naval Command and the Black Sea Fleet. They are currently gathering force and have moved command to Odessa, and the final planning for the amphibious assault by the Danube Flotilla and 46th Army begins yesterday, the 11th. There is an issue that the Soviets will have to deal with here in general, a pretty big one: the new recruits. See, over the past few months, 2nd Ukrainian Front has gotten 265,000 conscripts from territory taken, and 3rd Ukrainian, 80,000 of them. And all these guys need basic military training. They don't have experience for the most part, and they need Soviet political training too. Remember, not just they, but the bulk of the Red Army have never been abroad and are about to fight across the line between communism and capitalism. The troops listened to hundreds of lectures on the aim of the Soviet invasion, the criminal activities of the Antonescu clique, the squalor in which the Romanian peasants lived, and the unjust oppression of the Romanian working classes, exploited by their German occupiers and native capitalists alike. Nor did the enemy escape the attentions of the political administration. The Romanian lines were blasted with loudspeaker broadcasts urging the Romanian soldiers to abandon their German allies. The Romanians are well aware that at some point the Soviet avalanche is going to descend upon them, and by now there is serious strain in the country. The Communist Party began plans last month already for an armed uprising in Bucharest, and on the 5th, at the end of last week, Romanian leader Ion Antonescu visited Hitler at Rastenburg to talk about the whole situation, both the political and the military. Romania remained in the war at Germany's side, so even though the Soviets have suggested armistice terms to him, he obviously feels that everything is not lost. However, Army Group South Ukraine, although entirely dependent on the Romanian railroads and forced in large part to subsist off the local economy, had no executive authority in Romania. Everything had to be decided between Bucharest and Berlin. And the Army Group staff by late July was convinced that on the most important question, Romanian loyalty to the alliance, something was seriously out of tune. That Antonescu, on whose personal authority alone the alliance was based, no longer possessed the authority seemed to be no secret to anyone in Romania. Hitler still has his authority, of course, even in the occupied territory, and he's making it felt this week in Normandy. Okay, I'll get there in a minute. See, the British finally take Montpasson the 6th, preventing the Germans from using it as a hinge to withdraw their forces to the southwest around. And this has loosened the defenses south of Caumont, and the attacks gained speed. All was going well. The western end of the German line was in disarray, and it looked as if 7th Army would soon be either ground into dust or put into the bag if the southwest thrust from Caumont could cut the German line of retreat towards the Seine. Then, on that day of August 7th, when all was going well, but before the trap could be closed, the Germans struck back hard at Mortain. See, the German commanders all think that only by pulling back to or beyond the Seine can they stave off disaster. But Adolf Hitler does not think this. He thinks the biggest threat to them is the American advance towards Brittany and the Loire, and also that his forces can check that advance long enough for the V-weapons attacks on London to force the Allies to negotiate. No one else at OKW thinks this, but after the July 20th bombing plot, no one is willing to argue. The Fuhrer wants an armored attack through Mortain towards Avranches, and this he will have. On the 6th, Hitler says he's sending 7th Army 60 Panzer and 80 Mark IV tanks, but he also makes some huge changes to the offensive plans, which are already made, threatening chaos. Commander in the West, Gunther von Kluge, pleads with Hitler and does get the okay to go ahead with his original plan. But Hitler ends with this: the CNC West has a unique opportunity to drive into an extremely exposed enemy area and thereby to change the situation completely. This fantasy completely ignores the overwhelming Allied air forces and what the British and Canadian attacks are doing to German communications lines and their attacks towards Falaise. Kluge still thinks they can maybe reach Avranches. Maybe. Just past midnight, the night of the 6th, the attacks begin. On the 7th, 2nd Panzer Division does reach the center of Mortain, but heavy Allied air attacks prevent any more gains. Gerhard von Schwerin, commanding 116th Panzer Division, does not advance to cover 2nd Panzer Division, though, thinking that he might be surrounded if he does, so he just disobeys orders. He is relieved of command at 4 p.m. the 7th, but the damage is done. The Americans are alerted, and the skies are full of Allied planes. Hitler decides this is Kluge's fault and takes personal charge of the offensive and orders 3 Panzer divisions from the Camp Falaise front to head over to the Mortain one. 5th Panzer Army Commander Heinrich Eberbach has just told Hitler that he cannot hold the Camp Falaise front without reinforcements. And Kluge gets to call him and tell him he's not only not getting any, he's losing 3 Panzer divisions. Kluge also says this: I foresee that the failure of this attack at Mortain can lead to the collapse of the entire Normandy front, but the order is so unequivocal that it must be obeyed. Those tanks cannot travel in daylight, though, because of Allied planes. So the next attack is scheduled for the 11th, with Eberbach coming over to run the armor. He does not think he can get moving until the 20th, though, which pisses off Hitler, of course. But other events in Normandy are seriously changing the situation. Okay. Operation Totalize goes off the 7th. This is attacks by Canadian 1st Army towards Falaise. Here is Allied Ground Forces Commander Bernard Montgomery's directive. Object of the operation: A. To break through the enemy positions south and southeast of Caen and to gain such ground in the direction of Falaise as will cut off the enemy forces now facing 2nd Army and render their withdrawing eastward difficult, if not impossible. B. Generally to destroy enemy equipment and personnel as a preliminary to a possible wide exploitation of success. All the bridges over the Seine have been destroyed, so the German forces could be pressed back against it and also destroyed. But the Canadian army has to first get enough space so they can swing their right flank around, and that means Falaise. The attacks begin with 1,000 bombers hitting enemy positions the 7th. The ground attacks make some progress, but the going from the 8th is a lot tougher, and there is stiff resistance, and by the 10th, they are stopped at Kenay Woods. So Operation Totalize comes to its end. But though stopped, the attackers have advanced 15 kilometers through a series of defense lines and are at least within sight of Falaise. They now plan another full-scale attack there, Operation Tractable, to go off next week. As for the American attacks that have broken through near the coast, on the 6th they nearly reach Lorient on the coast and Le Mans inland. They enter the latter the following day. On the 7th in Brittany, they attack Brest, Saint-Malo, and Lorient, and on the 10th near the mouth of the Loire, 20th Corps takes Nantes. Inland on the 9th, 15th Corps turns from Le Mans north towards Argentan to hopefully link up with the Canadians. Kluge follows this, though, and realizes that the Allies are trapping the Mortain force into a pocket. and tells Hitler to call off the Avranches attack, pull the Mortain salient back, and then 1st SS, 2nd Panzer, and 116th Panzer Division should all attack US 15th Corps south of Alençon and the German supply depot. Hitler says, okay, let's get it done next week. But today, as the week ends, US 15th Corps takes Alençon. The Mortain counterattack had now lasted 6 days and achieved virtually nothing. Nor had this German thrust restricted American progress elsewhere. 19th Corps had continued to push down from the north, and 5th Corps had moved south of Vire. All was now ready for a complete encirclement of the German units remaining in Normandy, and the final trap began to close around them at Falaise. There are further Allied advances to cover this week as well in other parts of the world. In Italy, the capture of Florence is completed, and Guam is liberated. The fighting on Guam is pretty heavy, the 7th actually, but when American forces overrun Mount Santa Rosa, the 8th, the Japanese pull back to the north end of the island. By the 10th, it's all over, and the US now has all the Marianas to use as a major naval and air base to attack Japan. There are stragglers on Guam, and at least one will stay in the jungle until 1972. The Americans have 1,300 men killed and 5,700 wounded or missing. Of the Japanese garrison of over 10,000, there are fewer than 100 prisoners. 77th Infantry Division Chief of Staff Colonel Douglas McNair is killed on Guam on the 6th during a mission to try to find a new command post. I mention this because his father, General Leslie McNair, was killed 2 weeks ago when Allied planes accidentally bombed the Allied lines in France, as we saw. The general is so far the highest-ranking American officer to die in this war. But there is also a notable advance by the Axis this week. On the 8th is the fall of Hengyang to the Japanese in China. They have gotten 2, some sources say 3, divisions of reinforcements there, and finally crush what's left of Fang Xianghui's forces holding the town. Chiang Kai-shek promised him a tank regiment to relieve the siege, but that has not materialized. By this week, Fang has fewer than 2,000 men capable of bearing arms in the city. He sends a farewell message to Chiang and then attempts suicide, but his subordinates prevent it. Unable to die and unable to fight, Fang eventually chose to negotiate for something like an honorable surrender. He promised to lay down weapons in exchange for medical treatment for all the wounded soldiers. But what was predicted by the Allies to hold for 7 days has held for 47, so Fang did really well. His 17,000 men held out against a total of over 100,000 of the enemy and caused casualties in the tens of thousands, though estimates vary too widely to really trust any of them specifically. Chiang also admits that he himself made many mistakes during this campaign, though he puts more blame for its failure on training and intelligence deficiencies. And though the Japanese praise the Chinese for their remarkable defense of Hengyang, Chiang's leadership is ever more criticized by the Americans, who want him to turn over all his forces to Vinegar Joe Stilwell. And the Chinese communists are growing ever stronger and gaining ever more popular support. Chiang writes in his diary, the 11th, "As long as I lived, the country would have a future. Neither the communist bandits nor the Japanese invaders would succeed if I were around. If I kill myself due to discouragement and pessimism, my country and people would then perish together." So Chiang has no intention of giving up control to anyone, anywhere. Or killing himself, I guess. And that is the week. With the Americans on the move in Brittany, the Germans trying something in Normandy but now being nearly surrounded, Florence falling to the Allies, Soviet attacks slowing down all over their front, the brutality of the Warsaw Uprising, the Americans securing the Marianas, and the Japanese taking Hengyang. That is a busy week. Also, on the 12th, the first Pluto pipeline under the ocean is operational, carrying fuel from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg. I will end a bit differently today, with something post-Hengyang. Fang Xianghui is taken prisoner by the Japanese, and Emperor Hirohito personally appoints him to be commander of a puppet military unit, the Shanghai Army, composed in part of what's left of Fang's garrison. I'm guessing he accepted this as a means to avoid being massacred, but whatever it was, Chinese special forces will run a daring operation in December, and Fang and his officers will escape. He will arrive in Chongqing to a hero's welcome from Chiang Kai-shek and be awarded the Order of Blue Sky and White Sun for outstanding contributions to national security under foreign invasion. If you want to see how things were for Chiang Kai-shek 20 years ago in the 1920s, then check out this 1926 episode of Between Two Wars. It is very good. And if you want to see more of this excellent content, then join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest officers, and the Army member of the week is John Spielman. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.